Gold was heavy, slow, and honest. It could be counted, weighed, and melted. Then one ordinary August day in 1971, money forgot its weight. From that moment on, value would be whatever a credible voice could convince the world to believe. Welcome to Money Lore. This is the story of how faith replaced gold, how the United States closed the door on metal and opened an era where promises, well managed, became the most powerful currency on earth. For centuries, gold and silver kept governments honest the hard way. A king could decree all he liked. If his coins were shaved or debased, merchants noticed. Trade slowed, prices rose, and the metal fled to safer mints. Banks tried to speed things up with paper, receipts for deposits, notes redeemable for coin. But the paper was a bridge, not the island. Behind every bill lived a weight of metal, and behind that weight lived trust. After two world wars, the world needed more than bridges. It needed a common map. In 1944, at a New Hampshire hotel called Bretton Woods, delegates from the Allied nations wrote one. The dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, and other major currencies would fix to the dollar. The United States, with the largest economy, deep capital markets, and most of the world's gold in its vaults, became the anchor. Foreign central banks could hold dollars because those dollars could be turned into metal on demand. The promise was simple. The dollar was as good as gold. Promises face reality. In the 1960s, Washington tried to fight a war in Vietnam and a war on poverty at the same time while keeping taxes palatable and the exchange rate fixed. Dollars flowed out to pay for imports, bases, and allies. Gold flowed out to those who asked for coin instead of paper. European leaders, most loudly Charles de Gaulle, called in shipments of bullion. The London Gold Pool, an alliance of central banks defending the $35 price, strained to hold the line. The more the world doubted, the faster the metal moved. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and did something most citizens did not yet understand. He closed the gold window, suspending the dollar's convertibility into gold. It sounded temporary. It became permanent. The next few years finished the transformation. Currencies began to float, exchange rates moved by markets rather than ministries, and the global standard turned from metal to managed belief. So what kept paper honest after the metal left? Not magic, institutions. The dollar's new backing was a stack of real things: a tax base, the rule of law, deep debt markets, and the productive capacity of an economy that could actually make and ship what the world wanted. Legal tender laws said dollars must settle debts in U.S. courts. Treasury bonds gave savers a benchmark instrument. The Federal Reserve learned to target inflation rather than gold flows. And oil priced in dollars, backed by U.S. security guarantees, recycled export surpluses into the same bonds that financed the state. Metal had been replaced not by thin air, but by a web. The 1970s tested that web to the edge. As the peg dissolved, prices ran. Two oil shocks smashed supply, wage bargains assumed yesterday's inflation would return tomorrow, and the public learned a new word: stagflation. The fix did not come from mines. It came from policy. In 1979, Paul Volcker took the Federal Reserve's helm and did something brutal and simple. He made money expensive. Interest rates rose into the teens. Recession followed. But the signal was clear. If the new era depended on belief, then the central bank would defend that belief with pain. Inflation broke. The dollar's reputation, no longer chained to metal, was chained to discipline. From there, the architecture of modern money took shape. Floating exchange rates let countries absorb shocks with prices rather than with stockpiles. Central banks developed inflation targets. Markets learned to read their language as carefully as merchants once weighed coins. Banks invented more ways to hold and move claims: futures, swaps, structured obligations. The plumbing became intricate, but the principle was straightforward. Money is a high-speed claim on real output, and the system survives if those claims grow no faster than what the world can actually produce. Then came 2008, when a world built on confident claims discovered just how quickly confidence can vanish. Mortgage securities cracked, interbank trust evaporated, and the financial system began to seize. No gold window existed to stem the panic. Instead, central banks created reserves and bought bonds, swapping shaky private paper for public promises. Quantitative easing looked radical on a chart and routine on a balance sheet. Expand the central bank's liabilities to keep the arteries open. It worked in the narrow sense. Markets reopened, banks survived, but it taught a habit. Once promises solve a crisis, promises become the first tool on the shelf. Another shock in 2020 pushed the lesson further. With economies locked down, governments issued income on paper to replace the income that factories and restaurants could not produce. Central banks again bought the debt to keep rates low. For a time, the math looked painless. Then supply reopened unevenly, spending met shortages, and prices climbed. The restraint of the Volcker era had to be relearned in softer tones. Gradual rate hikes, shrinking balance sheets, careful speeches designed to keep belief intact without breaking the patient. If it all feels abstract, trace it through an ordinary month. Your wages are digits. Your card authorizes a promise between banks. The grocery store accepts those promises because its own bank believes the chain of settlement will be honored by other banks and, ultimately, by a legal system that can make a broken promise expensive. None of this requires an ounce of gold to move. It requires millions of smaller promises being kept on time by institutions that have more to lose from lying than from telling the truth. Of course, belief has enemies. Persistent deficits test patience. Rapid money growth tests prices. Banking crises test the plumbing. Geopolitics tests the reserve. If the dollar is power, then using that power in sanctions or politics must be balanced against other nations' desire to diversify away from it. Economists gave this tension a name during the Bretton Woods years. The Triffin dilemma. The world wants more safe dollars to trade with, but creating too many undermines the dollar's safety. In the fiat age, the dilemma survives. The anchor is not a metal buried in Kentucky. It is trust buried in habits, data, and the memory of how authorities behave when it's hard. Faith replaced gold does not mean belief replaces production. It means the bridge we all walk between what we promise and what we can deliver now rests on human systems rather than on geology. The United States can create dollars, but not wheat or microchips by decree. Europe can set a policy rate, but not conjure skilled workers. Japan can cap yields, but the bill arrives in a weaker currency or a future budget. In every case, the story returns to the same parsimonies. Claims must meet capacity. When they do, the faith feels invisible. When they don't, you see the seam in the form of inflation, devaluation, or controls. If you want to understand the post-gold world without equations, picture a scale. On one side, promises, bank deposits, pensions, bonds, government guarantees. On the other, the ability to deliver, taxes collected, goods produced, energy generated, courts that enforce. Credibility is the balance between the two. Tip toward promises and the scale creaks. Prices move to compensate. Tip toward delivery and the promises feel light, rates fall, growth breathes. The job of modern money's managers is not to polish coins. It is to keep that scale believable. The surprise of this era is how resilient belief can be when institutions behave. A nation that taxes predictably, publishes honest numbers, protects creditors under fair courts, and allows failure to clear excesses can run a fiat system for generations. Its currency becomes others' savings. Its bonds become the yardstick for every other price. That is the quiet miracle of the dollar since 1971, and the quiet warning, the same system that runs on good behavior fails when bad. Gold has not disappeared. It lives in vaults and in the minds of people who prefer weight to words. But the day-to-day money we earn, save, and spend is a social technology. It is a ledger we maintain together, policed by auditors and courts rather than by mints. When leaders speak carelessly, the ledger trembles. When they speak plainly and act consistently, the ledger steadies. The choice is less romantic than a coin and more demanding than a peg. The end of gold did not end honesty. It moved honesty from metal to method. In 1971, money stopped promising, "I am this many ounces," and started promising, "I will hold my power because the people who run me will not lie." Some years we kept that promise. Some years we did not. History keeps the score in purchasing power. Faith replacing gold was not a trick. It was an admission. The real constraint on money isn't how much metal we can mine. It's how much trust we can earn and keep. When that trust is guarded with discipline, paper behaves like gold without the shackles. When it isn't, prices rewrite the story until the managers learn to tell the truth again. If this gave you a clearer way to see the world after gold, stay with money lore. The metal mattered. The method matters more.